A flight attendant mocked an old man in first class, until she found out he owned the plane. But it's what Clint Eastwood did next that silenced the entire cabin. Join me till end of this story and subscribe my channel for more. She barely glanced at Clint Eastwood. To her, he was just another older man in a worn leather jacket, gray stubble, and that quiet, steely look some retirees wore like an old medal. She had more important things to do. First-class passengers were already demanding extra champagne. The pilot was irritated about a delay, and the new intern had just spilled cranberry juice on the emergency binder. So when the man in seat 2 politely asked for a coffee, black, no sugar, she gave a tight smile and muttered, "Sir, please wait your turn." "I'll be back when I can." He didn't protest. He didn't complain. He just nodded once, slow, deliberate, the way a man does when he's used to people underestimating him. She didn't know that the boots he wore had been through more deserts and battlefields than she could name, that the calluses on his hands weren't from typing or golf, they were from work, war, and survival. And she definitely didn't know he owned the very plane they were standing in. Clint Eastwood had flown under the radar his entire life. Not because he had to, but because it gave him something most men lost the moment they became famous. The truth about how people really treat each other. He looked out the window, watching the rain beat across the glass as ground crew rushed by. He wasn't angry. He wasn't surprised. He'd spent years in rooms full of people who spoke loud and said nothing. People like this flight attendant, who thought politeness was optional and humility a weakness. But what she didn't realize was this: by the time this flight was over, she wouldn't just remember him, she'd never forget him. The cabin door finally sealed. The engines roared to life and the plane began to taxi. Clint sat quietly, his fingers folded, eyes half closed, not asleep but listening. He wasn't the kind of man who needed to speak to own a room. He let the room figure it out. The flight attendant, whose name tag read Brooke, moved briskly through the aisle, ignoring him completely now. She laughed with the businessman in 2B, flirted lightly with the loud guy in 1A who bragged about closing deals over Napa wine, and gave extra snacks to the influencer live streaming. Her first-class experience, Clint got nothing. Not even eye contact. Is he even supposed to be up here? One man muttered under his breath. Brooke didn't correct him. Instead, she leaned down with a fake smile and asked Clint, "Sir, are you flying standby? Do you have your boarding pass handy?" Clint slowly turned to her, eyes narrowing just slightly. "You already scanned it." She tilted her head and smiled in that condescending way people do when they're trying to be polite to someone they believe is beneath them. "Right," she said. "But we've had some mistakes lately. Just want to be sure you're in the right place." The cabin fell into an awkward silence. The nearby passengers glanced over, some chuckling quietly, enjoying the awkward theater. Clint didn't move. "I'm in the right place," he said, his voice low, dry as desert wind. Brooke hesitated. Something in his tone made her chest tighten. Not fear, not yet. The discomfort, like she just touched something old and sharp and underestimated it. Then a voice came over the intercom. It wasn't the pilot. It was the owner's rep, a woman named Janet, who occasionally flew when Clint did, mostly to make sure his flights went smooth and unnoticed. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard. Please extend your courtesy to Mr. Eastwood today. We're grateful to have him aboard. Cabin crew, please check in with the owner before we begin service." Brooke froze. "Owner?" Her face turned pale. A slow, creeping realization climbed up her spine like cold fog. Mr. Eastwood, the man in 2A, didn't just belong in first class. He owned the whole damn plane. Brooke stood motionless in the aisle, her smile faltering into a stiff line. The passengers who had earlier laughed at Clint now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The businessman next to him cleared his throat and turned away. Suddenly fascinated with the emergency exit card, Clint said nothing. He didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He just looked ahead as if none of this surprised him, because it idea in single quotes. Brooke finally found her voice, though it trembled like a leaf in wind. "Mr. Eastwood, I apologize. I didn't realize." He turned slowly Toward her, those legendary eyes locking onto hers. The same eyes that had once stared down villains in the dust of the Wild West. Now, they looked at her not with anger, but with something worse. Disappointment. You shouldn't treat people different just because you think they can't afford to be here, he said quietly. The words hit harder than any shout ever could. The nearby passengers, especially those who'd snickered earlier, now kept their heads down. Brooke swallowed hard, her cheeks flushing deep red. I didn't mean to, he cut her off with a simple gesture of his hand, not rude. Just, final. Don't apologize because you found out who I am. Apologize because of how you acted when you thought you knew. It was like a needle had popped the pressurized cabin. A long, suffocating silence followed. Brooke nodded quickly and walked away, stumbling a little as she disappeared behind the galley curtain. The air felt heavier now. Like the plane had shifted its center of gravity around one man in seat 2. Adot the influencer put her phone down. The businessman folded his newspaper, avoiding eye contact, and Clint. He just returned to the sky. The clouds outside drifted by like slow-moving ghosts. But inside, everyone knew they'd witnessed something they'd carry long after the wheels touched down. A reminder that status doesn't come from noise. It comes from presence. And Will Money, Dirty Harry, the man with no name. Clint Eastwood himself had just taught a full cabin that lesson without lifting more than a finger. The seatbelt sign was still lit, but the tension in the cabin had shifted. Clint sat calmly, sipping the cup of black coffee that had finally been placed in front of him. It wasn't the drink that mattered, it was the gesture. A silent apology, warm and bitter. Brooke hadn't returned yet. She was in the galley, staring at the metal cabinet door, her reflection staring back at her with flushed cheeks and wet eyes. The moment replayed in her head, the way she had brushed him off, the tone she'd used, the assumption she'd made. She hadn't dismissed a man. She had dismissed Clint Eastwood, and worse, someone who had said nothing but please and thank you. A knock interrupted her shame spiral. It was the owner's rep, Janet. She wants to talk to you, Janet said gently. Brooke stepped out, nervous. But Clint wasn't looking at her. He was speaking quietly to the older woman seated in 4C, a sweet grandmother who had been struggling to reach her bag earlier. Clint had noticed, and without a word had helped her retrieve it, placed it gently at her feet, and offered her the rest of his bottled water. The woman smiled like she'd been touched by royalty. In a way, she had. Clint turned back to his seat, only now noticing Brooke lingering. He gave a small nod. Everything okay now? His voice was even, calm, but there was a softness in it, not sarcasm, not scorn. Just space to grow. I'm sorry, Brooke said again, this time with no defense in her voice. You were kind to me. I was rude. I shouldn't have acted like that. Clint looked at her a long moment, then offered a ghost of a smile. We all have bad days. Just don't let them turn you into someone you're not proud of. That was it. No lecture. No demand. Just a simple truth spoken by a man who had lived 100 lives, carried 1,000 regrets, and knew that dignity meant giving grace, even to those who didn't deserve it yet. Brooke blinked hard to hold back tears. For a second she felt like a kid again, being corrected by her grandfather, not punished, just reminded of who she could be, and that's what made it hit so deep. She walked back to the galley lighter than before. And Clint? He returned to the clouds, one boot resting across his knee, his coffee cooling beside him. He didn't just own the plane. He owned the moment. The flight began its descent. The clouds had cleared now, leaving behind a golden wash of afternoon sunlight that streamed through the windows like a blessing. The captain's voice echoed calmly over the speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. Most passengers obeyed, but something about the mood in the cabin had shifted. There was a weight in the air that no turbulence could explain. People weren't scrolling on their phones anymore. They weren't talking over each other. They were watching him. Clint Eastwood didn't demand attention. He drew it by being still. As Brooke walked the aisle for final checks, she paused at his row, not to serve him, not to correct him, but because she wanted to. Can I bring you anything, Mr. Eastwood? she asked, this time softly, respectfully. He looked up, eyes calm, and gave a light shake of his head. You've done enough. There was no edge to it, just closure, but then something unexpected happened. From the inside pocket of his jacket, Clint pulled out a small leather envelope, worn, scuffed, and tied with a frayed string. He motioned to Brooke and handed it to her without a word. She opened it carefully. Heart racing. Inside was a handwritten note, and something else, a full scholarship voucher, addressed to Brooke Chambers Aviation Training Program. She stared at it, stunned. The note read, "You've got heart. You just need direction. Use this to find it. C.E." Tears welled in her eyes. For real this time. No shame, no pretense. She couldn't speak. She just nodded, overwhelmed. Other passengers looked on, not quite knowing what had just happened, but feeling something bigger than any viral video could capture. A man with global fame, who didn't shame her, he lifted her. Quietly. As the landing gear dropped and the runway grew closer, Clint Eastwood leaned back, adjusted his jacket, and closed his eyes, not out of weariness, but out of peace. Because real power doesn't humiliate. Real legends leave people better than they found them, and that's exactly what he did. One row, one lesson, one moment at a time. The wheels touched down with a soft thud. The cabin jolted gently and the flaps hissed as the plane slowed across the tarmac. But no one was in a rush to grab their bags. Something rare had happened on that flight. Something human, something real. The kind of story that doesn't need cameras or headlines. The kind that lives quietly in people's hearts long after the seatbelt sign goes off. As the plane taxied to the private hangar, the passengers began to rise. Clint Eastwood stood up slowly, stretching his back with the grace of a man who'd lived too many lives in one. He didn't speak to anyone, didn't wave, didn't expect thanks. And yet, they all watched him go, not because he demanded it, because he earned it. Brooke, still holding the envelope with trembling hands, stood by the door, unsure of what to say. No words seemed big enough, deep enough, right enough. Clint paused as he stepped past her. It's not about who sees you, he said without turning. It's about what you do when no one's watching. And then he was gone. The doors opened. Sunlight poured in. A black SUV waited on the tarmac. Clint climbed in without a glance back, the door shutting quietly behind him. As the plane emptied, passengers spoke in hushed tones. He was on the flight? Was that really him? Did you hear what he did for the attendant? But the ones who really paid attention didn't speak much. They just thought a little deeper, held their tempers a little longer, and looked at people a little more kindly than before. And Brooke? She framed that note. As she took that scholarship, years later when she earned her captain's wings, she'd look at every passenger who sat in TUA and remember the day a man reminded her. Dignity doesn't raise its voice, it simply changes. The room. Because real legends don't just fly first class. They lift others off the ground.